Walter Briggs was 74 years old when he took his first step onto Highway 52, a canvas duffel bag over his shoulder and a photograph in his shirt pocket, so worn the faces had nearly faded to ghosts. He walked for 23 days. He walked through rain that soaked through his coat and cold that settled into his bones like something that had always lived there. He walked until his boots split at the soles and his feet bled into his socks, until strangers stopped asking if he needed help because the answer was written in every line of his face. When he finally reached the small blue house at the end of Marigold Lane in Ashburn, Virginia, he stood at the gate for 11 minutes before he could make himself open it. He had imagined this moment for 19 years. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would explain, how he would beg if begging was what it took. What he hadn't imagined, what he couldn't have prepared for, was the woman who opened the door. She was 42 years old, and she looked exactly like her mother. But it wasn't her face that broke him. It was the small boy standing behind her, clutching her leg with one hand and holding a wooden cross in the other. A cross Walter had carved himself 47 years ago for a daughter he'd told the world was dead. The Briggs family had lived on the same 80 acres of land in Harlan County, Kentucky, for 4 generations. The house Walter grew up in was the house his grandfather had built with his own hands, board by board, nail by nail, from timber cut from the mountain that rose behind it like a permanent witness to everything that happened below. It wasn't a large house, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that doubled as everything else, a porch that wrapped around the front, like arms waiting to hold someone. But it was solid. It had survived floods and mine collapses, and the slow economic death that had hollowed out most of Harlan County by the time Walter was a young man. The Briggs family survived because they were stubborn, and because they didn't ask anyone for anything, and because they believed, with a faith that bordered on religion, that a man's worth was measured by his refusal to bend. Walter learned this from his father, Clyde, who had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his. The lesson was never spoken directly. It didn't need to be. It was in the way Clyde's jaw tightened when anyone mentioned charity. It was in the way he worked 12-hour shifts at the mine and came home and worked 6 more on the land and never complained, not once, not even when the black lung started taking his breath in increments so small you could only see them looking back across years. It was in the way he looked at Walter when Walter was 9 years old and crying because the other boys had pushed him down in the schoolyard, not with comfort, but with something harder, something that said, "You have a choice right now. You can be a Briggs or you can be something else. And if you're something else, you're on your own." Walter chose to be a Briggs. He stopped crying that day. He stopped crying altogether, as far as anyone could tell, for the next 65 years. He married young, the way men in Harlan County did. Her name was Ellen, and she was the daughter of the Baptist preacher in Pine Mountain, and she had a laugh that sounded like water running over stones, and a gentleness that Walter didn't understand, but was drawn to anyway, the way a man dying of thirst is drawn to a river, even if he's never learned to swim. Ellen saw something in him that nobody else saw. Or maybe she saw the same thing everyone saw, the hardness, the stubbornness, the wall he'd built around himself. And she just believed there was something softer underneath. She spent 31 years trying to reach it. She never stopped believing it was there, even when the evidence suggested otherwise, even when Walter made it as difficult as a man can make a thing. They had one child, a daughter. They named her Ruth, after Ellen's grandmother, and from the moment she was born, Walter didn't know what to do with her. Ruth was nothing like him. She was nothing like anyone in the Briggs family, as far as Walter could tell. She talked too much and laughed too easily, and asked questions that had no answers, and cried at things that shouldn't have mattered. A dead bird in the yard, a story in a book, the sound of the train whistle that echoed through the valley every night at 9:17. She was sensitive in a way that made Walter uncomfortable. She was soft in a way that he'd been taught to see as weakness. And she was his daughter, his only child, the continuation of the Briggs name for another generation. And he didn't know how to love her without trying to change her. So he tried to change her. He started young, the way his father had started with him. When Ruth was 4 and fell off the porch steps and split her lip on the bottom stair, he didn't pick her up. He stood over her and waited for her to stand up herself, and when she looked up at him with those wide brown eyes that were so much like Ellen's, eyes full of confusion and hurt, and the desperate hope that he would reach down and make it better, he felt something twist in his chest that might have been shame, but he didn't reach down. He couldn't. He told himself he was teaching her strength. He told himself he was preparing her for a world that wouldn't be gentle. He told himself he was being a good father, the way Clyde had been a good father, the way all the Briggs men had been good fathers, passing down the same lessons generation after generation like an inheritance no one had asked for and no one knew how to refuse. When Ruth was 7, she brought home a stray dog, a mutt, brown and white, skinny enough that you could count its ribs through its fur. She'd found it behind the school, she said. She'd been feeding it her lunch for 2 weeks. She'd named it Biscuit. Walter looked at the dog and looked at his daughter and saw in her face the same desperate hope she'd had at 4 years old when she was lying on those porch steps with blood on her chin. He told her to take it back where she found it. He told her they didn't need another mouth to feed. He told her that getting attached to things was a good way to get hurt, and the sooner she learned that, the better. Ruth cried for 3 days. Ellen said nothing, but she looked at Walter in a way that made him feel like she was seeing something he didn't want seen. The dog disappeared. Ruth never mentioned it again. By the time Ruth was a teenager, the distance between her and her father had become something you could almost see. It lived in the way she ducked her head when he entered a room. It lived in the way she spoke to him in monosyllables, answering questions but never starting conversations. It lived in the way she hugged Ellen but only nodded at Walter, and in the way Walter told himself that this was fine, this was normal, this was how fathers and daughters were supposed to be. He told himself he wasn't bothered by it. He told himself that raising a child wasn't about being loved. It was about preparing them to survive. But sometimes, late at night, when Ellen was asleep and the house was silent and the mountain outside the window was just a dark shape against a darker sky, he would think about the way Ruth had looked at him when she was small, before she learned to stop looking. And he would feel that same twist in his chest, that same thing that might have been shame, and he would push it down so far, he almost convinced himself it had never been there at all. Ruth was 17 when everything broke. She was in her senior year of high school, and she had dreams that Walter didn't understand. She wanted to go to college, not the community college in Harlan, the one where boys went to learn welding and girls went to learn nursing and everyone came home afterward because where else would they go? She wanted to go to a university, a real one in a city, far away from the mountain and the mine and the house her great-great-grandfather had built. She wanted to study literature. She wanted to read books and write about them, and maybe teach someday in a classroom, somewhere clean and bright, somewhere that didn't smell like coal dust and desperation. Walter listened to her talk about it once, just once, at the dinner table. Her face was lit up in a way he'd never seen. Her hands moved when she talked, shaping ideas out of air. She was so alive, so hopeful, so absolutely certain that the future could be different from the past. And Walter looked at her and felt something that took him years to name. He felt afraid. He told her no. He told her that Briggs women didn't leave Harlan County. He told her that college was for people who didn't know how to work with their hands. He told her that reading books for a living wasn't a real job, wasn't a real life, and if she thought he was going to spend money he didn't have so she could sit in a classroom and learn to look down on the people who raised her, she had another thing coming. Ruth stared at him across the table. Ellen stared at her plate. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, and the thing that was cut was something between father and daughter that would never fully heal. Not even 19 years later, not even when Walter finally stood on her porch with bleeding feet and a heart full of words he didn't know how to say. But Ruth didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just nodded once and stood up from the table and went to her room and closed the door behind her with a softness that was somehow worse than a slam. She's finally learning, Walter told himself. She's finally understanding how the world works. 3 months later, Ellen found the test. It was in the bathroom trash, buried under tissues, a white plastic stick with 2 pink lines. Ellen brought it to Walter, not because she wanted to, but because she knew he would find out eventually, and she thought it might be better if he heard it from her. She was wrong about that. There was no good way for Walter Briggs to hear that his 17-year-old daughter was pregnant. The father was a boy named Daniel Reese. He was 19, a year out of high school, working at the garage in town. He wasn't a bad kid. Ellen knew his mother from church, but he wasn't from one of the good families, the families with land and history and names that meant something in Harlan County. His father had left when he was young. His mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make rent most months. He had a tattoo on his forearm and drove a truck that was more rust than metal and had dreams of his own that didn't involve staying in Harlan County any longer than he had to. He loved Ruth. That was clear to anyone who saw them together. But to Walter Briggs, love was not the point. The point was shame. The point was what people would say. The point was 100 years of Briggs' reputation crumbling in a single act of teenage foolishness. He called Ruth into the living room. He made her stand while he sat in his father's chair, the same chair his father had sat in, the same chair his grandfather had sat in, and he asked her one question. Is it true? Ruth didn't lie. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. She just stood there, 17 years old and 9 weeks pregnant, and she looked at her father with an expression that was half defiance and half something else. Something that looked, if you knew how to see it, like a door closing. Yes, she said, it's true. Walter Briggs had been preparing his whole life for the moment when someone in his family would fail him. He just hadn't expected it to be Ruth. He hadn't expected it to be his daughter, the one person he'd worked hardest to shape, the one person who was supposed to carry the Briggs name into the future and prove that all his sacrifice, all his hardness, all those years of choosing strength over softness had meant something. He looked at her standing there, and he felt the shame rise up in him like water filling a mine shaft, dark and cold and drowning. And he did what Briggs men did when they felt something they couldn't control. He turned it into anger. He told her she had 24 hours to get out of his house. He told her she was no longer his daughter. He told her that if she walked out that door, she should never come back, because as far as he was concerned, she was dead. Ruth listened to all of it. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with those brown eyes, Ellen's eyes, and she said something that Walter would hear in his head every single day for the next 19 years. I know, she said. You've been waiting my whole life for an excuse to stop loving me. Now you finally have one. She was gone by morning. She took one bag. She left behind everything else. Her books, her clothes, the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3, the wooden cross Walter had carved for her when she was baptized at 8 years old. She left behind her mother, who stood at the window and watched her walk down the dirt road toward town and didn't say a word because there were no words for what was happening. No words for watching your only child disappear into a world that didn't care about her the way you did. She left behind her father, who sat in his chair and didn't watch at all, who told himself this was justice, this was consequence, this was what happened when you threw away everything your family had given you for a boy with a tattoo and a rusted truck. Ellen never forgave him. She never said that. She wasn't the kind of woman who said things like that out loud, but Walter knew. He knew it in the way she stopped touching him. He knew it in the way she started sleeping in Ruth's old room, surrounded by the books Ruth had left behind. He knew it in the way she prayed every single night, on her knees beside the bed, prayers that Walter could hear through the thin walls, prayers for Ruth, prayers for the grandchild she would never meet, prayers that Walter would not recognize as condemnation until years after Ellen was gone. She died 6 years after Ruth left. Stroke. Quick, the doctor said, which was supposed to be a comfort. She didn't suffer, but Walter knew she had suffered. She'd suffered every day since Ruth walked out that door. She'd just been too good, too gentle, too much like the woman she'd always been to let him see it. After Ellen died, Walter was alone on 80 acres of land, with nothing but his stubbornness and his silence, and the photograph he'd found in Ellen's nightstand, the only photograph of Ruth she'd kept, taken at her high school graduation, the last day any of them had been together in the same frame. He put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart. He told himself it was just a picture. He told himself it didn't mean anything. And every night for the next 13 years, he took it out and looked at it in the lamplight, looking at his daughter's face and trying to remember if he'd told her he loved her, even once, even one single time in 17 years. He couldn't remember. He was pretty sure the answer was no. Ruth Briggs became Ruth Reese 3 months after she left home. She married Daniel in a courthouse ceremony with no witnesses except the clerk. She was 17 and pregnant and terrified in ways she would never admit to anyone, not even herself. Daniel was 19 and working double shifts at the garage and promising her that everything would be okay, that they would figure it out, that he loved her enough to make up for everyone who didn't. She wanted to believe him. Some days she did. They moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat in Louisville. The rent was $380 a month, and most months they barely made it. Ruth got a job at a diner 6 blocks away, waiting tables until she was too pregnant to stand for 8 hours at a stretch. Daniel picked up extra work wherever he could find it. Oil changes, brake jobs, the occasional transmission rebuild for cash. They ate a lot of rice. They heated water on the stove when the hot water heater broke because they couldn't afford to fix it. Ruth read library books by the window at night because the lamp in the bedroom had stopped working and she couldn't bring herself to spend $4 on a new bulb. It wasn't the life she'd imagined. It wasn't the university, the classroom, the future she dreamed about at the dinner table while her father's face turned to stone. But it was hers. It was something she'd chosen, something she'd built with her own hands, and there was a kind of pride in that, even when the pride was the only thing between her and despair. The baby came on a Tuesday in March, a girl, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Ruth held her for the first time and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was locked. She named her Emma. She looked into her daughter's face, this tiny, perfect stranger who had come from her body and was now lying in her arms, blinking up at the ceiling with eyes that didn't know yet what kind of world they'd been born into. And she made a promise. Not out loud. She didn't need to say it out loud. She just made it, deep in the part of herself where the truest things lived. I will never make you feel like you're not enough. I will never make you earn my love. I will never give you a reason to leave and not come back. She kept that promise. For 19 years and counting, she kept it. Daniel died when Emma was 4, car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light at 2:14 in the morning, and Daniel, coming home from a late shift, never saw him coming. Ruth got the call at 2:47. She was standing in the kitchen making herself a cup of tea because she couldn't sleep. She never could sleep when Daniel was working late, some part of her always listening for the sound of his truck in the parking lot. And when the phone rang, she knew. Before she answered, before she heard the voice on the other end, before she learned the words that would divide her life into before and after, she knew. There are moments when the world shifts under your feet, and you can feel it happen, and there's nothing you can do except stand very still and wait to find out how bad it's going to be. This was one of those moments. She didn't cry at the funeral. She didn't cry for 3 weeks after. She went through the motions of being alive, feeding Emma, getting Emma dressed, taking Emma to the daycare she could no longer afford, picking her up, feeding her again, putting her to bed, sitting alone in the dark apartment and listening to the laundromat machines churning below. And she felt nothing. Not grief, not anger, not even the panic of wondering how she was going to survive. Just a vast gray emptiness where her heart was supposed to be. And then one night, 23 days after they put Daniel in the ground, Emma climbed into her lap and put both hands on Ruth's face and said, "Mama, you're allowed to be sad." And Ruth broke. She cried the way the creek ran after a heavy rain, fully, loudly, her voice filling the apartment, her body shaking with the force of everything she'd been holding back. Emma held on to her the whole time, 4 years old and solid as a rock, patting her mother's hair and saying, "It's okay, Mama, it's okay, I'm here." And Ruth thought about her own father and how he'd never held her when she cried, and she held her daughter tighter and cried harder and promised herself again that she would never, never be him. The years that followed were hard in ways that are difficult to describe unless you've lived them. Ruth worked. That was the simple way to say it. But the word worked doesn't capture the reality of what it means to raise a child alone, on no money in a country that has no patience for single mothers, no safety net for women whose husbands die too young, no room in its equations for the kind of grinding, unglamorous survival that doesn't make for inspiring stories because there's nothing inspiring about it. It's just exhaustion, day after day, year after year, doing what has to be done because the alternative is giving up. And giving up isn't an option when you have a 4-year-old who looks at you like you're the whole world. She worked at the diner during the day and cleaned offices at night. She slept 4 hours a night for so long that her body forgot what 8 hours felt like. She learned to stretch $1 until it begged for mercy. Rice and beans, beans and rice, the same 5 meals on rotation, buying Emma's clothes at Goodwill and telling her they were vintage because it sounded better, keeping the heat at 58 degrees in the winter and wearing 3 sweaters instead. She learned to smile when she wanted to scream. She learned to say, "I'm fine," when she was anything but. She learned to be strong because she didn't have any other choice, and somewhere in the learning, she became someone her father wouldn't have recognized. Not soft anymore, not sensitive in the way that used to make him uncomfortable, but something harder, something tempered by fire and loss, and the relentless necessity of keeping one small human being alive and fed and safe in a world that didn't care whether either of them made it. But she also became something else, something her father would never have allowed himself to be. She became kind, not the easy kind of kindness that costs nothing, the hard kind, the kind that comes from having been broken and choosing not to break other people, the kind that says, "I know what it feels like to have nothing, and I will make sure you don't feel that way." She tipped well, even when she couldn't afford it. She helped her neighbors carry groceries. She sat with the old woman in 4B when the old woman's son didn't call on Christmas, and she didn't say anything about how her own father hadn't called in 10 years, because what would be the point of saying it? She treated Emma's friends like her own children, feeding them and bandaging their scrapes and listening to their problems when their own parents were too busy or too checked out to notice. She built a life. It wasn't the life she'd imagined. It wasn't the university or the classroom or the future she'd dreamed about. But it was hers, and it was good, and it was full of love, and that was more than a lot of people ever got. When Emma was 12, Ruth started taking night classes. She didn't tell anyone, not her neighbors, not the women she worked with, not even Emma at first. She enrolled at the community college, 40 minutes away, and twice a week, she took the bus after her dinner shift and sat in a classroom full of people half her age and older, and tried to remember what it felt like to learn something that wasn't about survival. She studied literature the way she dreamed about at 17, back when her father sat across the table with a face like stone and told her no. She read Steinbeck and Faulkner and Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. She wrote essays in the margins of library books because she couldn't afford her own copies. She fell in love with words again, the way she'd loved them as a girl, before her father convinced her that loving things was a weakness, that joy was a liability, that the safest way to live was to want nothing at all. It took her 6 years to finish her associate degree, 6 years of night classes and weekend studying and falling asleep with textbooks on her chest and waking up at 5 a.m. to make Emma breakfast before the school bus came. She graduated when she was 36, and Emma, who was 18 by then and about to start college herself, sat in the front row and cried harder than Ruth had ever seen her cry. "You did it," Emma said afterward, hugging her so tight it hurt. "You actually did it." And Ruth laughed and cried at the same time and said, "We did it. I couldn't have done any of it without you." That was true. It was more true than Emma knew, because every time Ruth had wanted to quit, and there were many times, too many to count, she thought about her daughter's face. She thought about the promise she'd made in the hospital, holding a 7-pound baby who didn't know yet what kind of world she'd been born into. She thought about her own father, sitting in his chair in that house on the mountain, convinced that he was right, convinced that she was worthless, convinced that throwing her away was the same as strength. And she thought, "I will not let him be right. I will not let him win. I will build a life so full, so beautiful, so complete, that his absence will be a footnote, not a tragedy, and I will never, ever pass that emptiness on to my daughter." She kept going. By the time Emma was 22, Ruth was 39, and things had changed in ways that the 17-year-old girl who walked down that dirt road in Harlan County could never have imagined. Ruth had finished her bachelor's degree at 37, summa cum laude, with a thesis on representations of motherhood in Southern literature that her professor called one of the most moving pieces of academic writing I've read in 20 years of teaching. She'd been accepted to a graduate program at Georgetown, the same kind of university her father had called a waste of money, the same kind of dream he'd told her was impossible. She'd moved to Virginia to a small blue house at the end of Marigold Lane, and she'd planted a garden in the backyard and hung pictures on the walls and built a life that was hers, completely hers, with no room in it for the man who had told her she was dead. Emma was working on her own master's degree now in social work. She wanted to help families. She wanted to help children who'd been thrown away the way her mother had been thrown away. She had her grandmother Ellen's gentleness and her mother's determination and something else, something that was entirely her own, a fierce, quiet courage that made Ruth's heart ache every time she saw it. Emma was the best thing Ruth had ever done. She was proof that some kinds of breaking lead to better kinds of building. She was proof that the cycle could be stopped. And then, 3 weeks before Walter Briggs showed up at Ruth's door, Emma asked a question that changed everything. They were sitting on the porch. It was evening, late September, the kind of night when the air smells like wood smoke and dying leaves, and the light goes gold and amber before it fades to dark. Emma had come to visit for the weekend. She was living in D.C. now, 45 minutes away, but she came to see her mother as often as she could, which was every week sometimes, because that was the kind of relationship they had. They were drinking tea. They were talking about nothing, the way you do when you're comfortable with someone, when the silence between words is as meaningful as the words themselves. And then Emma looked at her mother and said, "Mom, why don't I know anything about your father?" Ruth's hands stopped moving. The tea in her cup went still. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind in the oak tree at the corner of the yard, a sound that Ruth suddenly found very loud, as if the world were holding its breath and waiting to see what she would say. Emma was looking at her, patient, gentle, but underneath the gentleness, something else, something that looked, if Ruth knew how to see it, like a need that had been waiting a long time to be spoken. "I know he's alive," Emma said. "I looked him up. Walter Briggs, Harlan County, Kentucky. I know where he lives. I know he's 74 years old. I know he's been alone since Grandma Ellen died. And I know you've never told me a single thing about him. Not one. In 22 years. She paused. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were serious. "I need to know why." Ruth put her tea down. She looked at her daughter, this beautiful, compassionate, whole human being she had raised, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. The memory of that night, the memory of standing in the living room, 17 and pregnant and terrified, listening to her father tell her she was dead, the memory of what it had cost her to survive it. And she realized Emma deserved to know, not just because she'd asked, not just because she was an adult now, capable of handling difficult truths, but because the story of Walter Briggs was part of Emma's story too. It was the shadow she'd been raised in, whether she knew it or not. It was the reason Ruth had made all the choices she'd made, loved the way she'd loved, fought the way she'd fought. Emma had a right to understand where she came from, even the parts that hurt. So, Ruth told her. She started at the beginning, the 80 acres, the mountain, the house her great-great-grandfather had built. She told her about Clyde and about Walter, and about the lessons passed down like an inheritance no one had asked for. She told her about the dog named Biscuit, and the split lip on the porch steps, and the way Walter had stood over her and waited for her to get up on her own. She told her about wanting to go to college, about the look on her father's face across the dinner table, about the night Ellen found the test in the bathroom trash. She told her about Daniel, about the courthouse wedding, about the studio apartment above the laundromat. She told her about the phone call at 2:47 a.m. and the gray emptiness and the night Emma had climbed into her lap and said, "Mama, you're allowed to be sad." She told her everything. When she was done, the light had gone from gold to gray. The tea was cold. Emma was crying, silently, the tears running down her cheeks in steady streams. Ruth reached over and took her daughter's hand, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emma said, "He never tried to find you?" Ruth shook her head. "In 19 years? He never called? He never wrote? He never..." "Never." Emma was silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more like Ruth's. "Then why is he still alive?" And Ruth, despite everything, laughed. It was a sad laugh, a laugh that hurt, but it was a laugh. Because that was such an Emma thing to say. Loyal to a fault, protective to a fault, ready to fight anyone who had ever hurt the people she loved. "Because killing him wouldn't undo it," Ruth said. "Because he's just an old man now, alone on a mountain with nobody but his memories. Because I survived him. That's the only revenge I need." But even as she said it, Ruth felt something shift. Some small, quiet door opening inside her, just a crack, just enough to let in a sliver of light. She hadn't thought about her father in years. She'd trained herself not to think about him, the way you train yourself not to touch a hot stove. But now, sitting on the porch with her daughter, talking about him for the first time in 2 decades, she felt the shape of him in her mind. Not as a monster, but as an old man, 74 years old, alone on 80 acres of land, with nothing but his stubbornness and his silence, and the photograph Ellen had kept in her nightstand. She wondered if he ever took it out and looked at it. She wondered if he remembered her face. She told herself it didn't matter. What Ruth didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that at the exact moment she was sitting on her porch in Virginia, telling her daughter the story of Walter Briggs. Walter Briggs was 300 miles away in Kentucky, standing in front of Ellen's grave, making a decision that would change everything. He had been coming to the cemetery every day for 13 years. Every single day, rain or shine, summer or winter, 9 a.m., without fail. He brought flowers when he could afford them. He brought himself when he couldn't. He sat on the ground beside the headstone that said, Ellen Briggs, beloved wife and mother, and he talked to her, out loud like a crazy person, like a man who had been alone so long that the line between living and dead had started to blur. He told her about the weather. He told her about the garden, what was growing and what wasn't. He told her about the ache in his knees and the way the house creaked at night, and the fox he'd seen crossing the back field 2 weeks ago, the first fox in 10 years. He told her everything except the thing that mattered, until that day. That day, September 18th, a Thursday, the light thin and pale and the air smelling like autumn, he sat down on the ground beside her grave and he said something different. Ellen, he said, I've been thinking about Ruth. He stopped. The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves on the oaks at the edge of the property. A crow called somewhere in the distance. He sat there, 74 years old, and he felt the words backing up in his throat like floodwater behind a dam. I've been thinking about her for 19 years, he said. I think about her every day. I think about what I said. I think about the look on her face. I think about the way she walked out that door and didn't look back, and I think about how I sat in my chair and told myself I was right. I was doing the right thing. I was being strong the way my father taught me to be strong. He paused. His voice cracked. I was wrong. He said it again, as if saying it once wasn't enough, as if the words needed to be driven into the ground like stakes. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about her. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what it means to be a father. I was so afraid of being weak that I became something worse. I became cruel. I became the thing I was most afraid of being. A failure, a coward, a man who couldn't love the people he was supposed to love. And now it's too late. It's too late, Ellen. She's out there somewhere, and she has a life, and I'm not part of it. And I did that. I chose that. I threw her away like she was nothing, and now she's everything I don't have. He was crying. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. Maybe when his father died, 40 years ago. Maybe not even then. The tears felt strange on his face, like they belonged to someone else, like his body had forgotten how to produce them and was learning all over again. He stayed at the grave until the sun started to set, and then, slowly, painfully, with the creak of joints that had been doing hard work for 74 years, he stood up. He looked at Ellen's headstone. He looked at the sky, going gold and amber and red, the same colors it went every night, the same colors it would go tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, whether he was here to see them or not. I'm going to find her, he said. I don't know if she'll listen. I don't know if she'll forgive me. I probably wouldn't forgive me, but I'm going to try, Ellen. I'm going to try. And if I die trying, at least I'll die doing something that matters, instead of sitting in that house, waiting for God to come take me. He didn't have a car. He'd sold it 3 years ago, when the money got tight and his eyesight got worse, and he realized he didn't have anywhere to go anyway. He didn't have money for a bus ticket. His Social Security barely covered the property taxes and the electricity, and there was nothing left over, hadn't been anything left over for years. He didn't have a phone or a computer or any way to find out where Ruth lived, but he had her name, he had the photograph, and he had 2 legs that still worked more or less if he didn't ask too much of them. It took him 3 days to prepare. He packed a canvas duffel bag with what he thought he'd need: a change of clothes, a water bottle, the photograph, the Bible. Ellen had read every night before bed, a pocket knife that had belonged to his grandfather. He studied the map he'd found in the attic, a road atlas from 1987, tracing the route from Harlan County to Virginia with his finger, counting the miles, dividing by the number of days he thought he could walk. 300 miles, give or take. 300 miles between him and his daughter. He left on a Monday morning. He walked out the front door, locked it behind him, put the key in his pocket. He didn't know if he'd ever use it again. He didn't know if he'd make it 300 miles. He didn't know if Ruth would be at the end of them, or if she'd moved, or if she'd slam the door in his face and tell him to go to hell. He didn't know anything, except that he had to try. The first week was the hardest. His body wasn't made for walking anymore. Not 20 miles a day, not 8 hours at a stretch, not on roads that weren't paved and hills that never seemed to end. His feet blistered on the second day. The blisters popped on the third. By the fourth day, he was bleeding into his socks, leaving red stains on the insoles of his boots, and he kept walking because stopping wasn't an option. He slept in fields. He slept in barns when farmers took pity on him. He slept under overpasses and in the doorways of abandoned gas stations, and once, for 3 hours, in the cab of a truck that a stranger let him use because the stranger had a father too somewhere, and he hoped someone would help his father if his father ever needed it. People asked him where he was going. He told them, Virginia. My daughter lives there. They asked him why he was walking. He told them that too, because I don't have any other way to get there. Because I have something to say to her, and I've waited 19 years to say it, and I'm not waiting anymore. Most of them looked at him like he was crazy. A few of them looked at him like they understood. One of them, a woman at a diner in West Virginia, 62 years old, hair gone gray, hands rough from decades of work, brought him a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs and refused to let him pay. She sat down across from him and looked at his face for a long moment, and then she said, I had a daughter too. She passed 5 years ago. Cancer. We hadn't spoken in 8 years before that because of something stupid, something that seemed important at the time and doesn't seem important at all anymore. I called her when she was in the hospital. I told her I was sorry. She said she'd already forgiven me years ago. She was just waiting for me to forgive myself. The woman looked at Walter with eyes that had seen too much. Don't wait, she said. Whatever you have to say to your daughter, don't wait, because you never know how much time you've got, and there's nothing in the world worse than running out of it. Walter nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. He ate the eggs. He drank the coffee. He thanked the woman and walked out the door and kept walking. 15 more miles that day, 18 the next, 22 the day after that. The woman's words echoing in his head like a song he couldn't stop hearing. Don't wait, don't wait, don't wait. By the time he reached Virginia, he had been walking for 23 days. His boots were held together with duct tape and prayer. His feet were more scar tissue than skin. He'd lost 15 pounds, maybe more. He'd been thin to begin with, and 3 weeks of walking on inadequate food had turned him into something skeletal, something that people crossed the street to avoid. His hands shook. His legs ached. Every step was a negotiation between his body and his will was winning, but barely. He'd found her address at a library in Charlottesville. A kind librarian, young, with glasses, and a patient smile, had helped him search the internet, a technology he didn't understand and had never used, until they found her. Ruth Reese, 47, Marigold Lane, Ashburn, Virginia. Occupation, adjunct professor of English, Northern Virginia Community College. The librarian printed out the address and handed it to him, and Walter held it like it was made of gold, like it was the most valuable thing he'd ever owned. She's 42, the librarian said. The librarian had done more searching than Walter knew. She has a daughter, Emma, 22 years old, a daughter, a grandchild, a family he'd never met, a family he'd chosen not to meet, a family he'd thrown away 19 years ago when he threw Ruth out the door. Walter stood outside the library, holding the piece of paper with his daughter's address, and he felt something he hadn't felt in so long he'd forgotten the name for it. Hope. He walked the final 40 miles in 3 days. He stopped sleeping. He couldn't. His body was too close to the end, and if he stopped moving, he wasn't sure he'd be able to start again. He walked through the suburbs of Northern Virginia, past shopping centers and housing developments, and schools full of children who stared at him through the windows, this dirty old man with a bag over his shoulder and blood on his boots. He walked until the numbers on the mailboxes started getting close to 47. He walked until he saw the blue house at the end of the lane, small and neat, with a garden in front and an oak tree in the corner of the yard and a porch with 2 chairs on it, 2 chairs sitting side by side, like they were waiting for someone. He stood at the gate for 11 minutes. He counted. He didn't know what else to do. And then, because he had walked 300 miles and lost 15 pounds and bled through his boots and slept in fields and barns in the cabs of strangers' trucks, and because he had come too far to turn back now, and because somewhere inside him, underneath all the stubbornness and the silence and the 74 years of choosing strength over softness, there was still something that might have been love, something that had never stopped being love, even when he pretended it wasn't there. He opened the gate. He walked up the path. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch. He stood in front of the door, his hand raised to knock. And then the door opened. Ruth was standing there, 42 years old, brown hair going gray at the temples, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 19 years ago. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, and she was holding a cup of coffee, and she was looking at him like she was seeing a ghost. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They just stood there, father and daughter, separated by 19 years and 300 miles and everything that had happened in between. And then a small figure appeared behind Ruth, a boy, 5 or 6 years old, with dark hair and curious eyes and a wooden cross in his hand, a cross that Walter recognized because he had carved it himself 47 years ago for a daughter he'd told the world was dead. That was when Walter broke. He didn't fall to his knees. His knees wouldn't have survived it, but something inside him collapsed. Something that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will for 23 days or 19 years or maybe his whole life. He looked at the boy with the cross, and he looked at Ruth, and he felt the tears come again, the second time in 3 weeks, the second time in 65 years. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was a cracked and broken thing, barely recognizable as his own. "I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for the dog. I'm sorry for the porch steps. I'm sorry for telling you no when you wanted to go to college, and I'm sorry for throwing you out, and I'm sorry for telling you you were dead, when the truth is, I was the one who was dead. I've been dead ever since that night. I've been walking around like a living person, but I've been dead inside, and I didn't know how to come back to life. And I know it's too late. I know I don't deserve anything. I know you have every right to slam this door in my face and never think about me again. But I had to come. I had to try, because I love you, Ruth. I have always loved you. I just didn't know how to say it. I didn't know how to be the kind of father who could say it. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ruth, he said, and his voice broke completely, and he couldn't finish the sentence. The boy with the cross stepped forward. He looked up at Walter with a face that was too solemn for a child, too wise, like he understood things that children weren't supposed to understand yet. "Are you my great-grandpa?" the boy asked. Ruth made a sound, half a laugh, half a sob. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder and she looked at Walter, really looked at him for the first time in 19 years. And she saw what 23 days of walking and 13 years of loneliness and a lifetime of being wrong had done to him. "Yes," she said. Her voice was unsteady, but it was there. "This is your great-grandpa Walter." The boy nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Then he held out the wooden cross, the cross Walter had carved so long ago, the cross Ruth had left behind, the cross that had somehow found its way across 19 years and 300 miles to end up in the hands of a great-grandchild Walter hadn't known existed. "Mama gave me this," the boy said. "She said her daddy made it. She said it was very special." Walter looked at the cross. He looked at Ruth. He looked at the boy, this small person with his blood running through his veins, this piece of a future he'd given up on ever having. "It is special," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "It's the most special thing I ever made." Ruth stepped aside. She didn't slam the door. She didn't tell him to go to hell. She just stepped aside, making room in the doorway, making room for him to enter if he wanted to. "You'd better come in," she said. "You look like you're about to fall over." Walter took a step forward, then another. He crossed the threshold of his daughter's house, the house she'd built without him, the life she'd made without him. He smelled coffee and something baking and lavender from the garden outside. He saw photographs on the walls, Ruth and Emma, Emma and the boy, people he didn't know living lives he hadn't been part of. And he understood, in a way he hadn't understood before, exactly what he'd lost, exactly what his stubbornness and his silence and his fear had cost him. 19 years of birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesdays. 19 years of watching his daughter grow, and his granddaughter grow, and his great-grandson be born. 19 years of being loved, if he'd only let himself be loved. If he'd only opened the door instead of slamming it shut. Ruth led him to the kitchen. She sat him down at the table. She poured him a cup of coffee and made him a sandwich because he looked like he hadn't eaten in a week, which was close to the truth. The boy, his name was Oliver, Ruth told him. He was Emma's son. He was 5 years old, sat across from him and watched him with those serious eyes, asking questions in the way children do, without any awareness of what's appropriate or inappropriate to ask. Why did you walk so far? Because I needed to see your grandmother. Why didn't you take a car? I don't have one. Why didn't you take a bus? I couldn't afford it. Why didn't you call? Because some things, Walter said slowly, carefully, as if he was working it out as he spoke, need to be said in person. Some things can't be said on a phone or written in a letter. Some things need you to show up, to stand there, to let the other person see that you mean it. Oliver thought about this. Then he nodded, satisfied. That makes sense, he said. Ruth stood at the counter, watching this conversation happen. Walter could feel her eyes on him. He didn't know what she was thinking. He didn't know if she was going to forgive him or hate him or something in between. He didn't know anything except that he was here, in her kitchen, drinking her coffee, talking to a great-grandson he hadn't known existed, and he was grateful. More grateful than he'd ever been for anything in his life. After a while, Oliver went to play. Ruth sat down across from Walter in the chair Oliver had vacated, and she looked at him. For a long time, she didn't speak. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car drove by, its engine fading into the distance. Then Ruth said, I spent 15 years hating you. Walter nodded. He deserved that. He didn't try to defend himself. I spent 15 years dreaming about this moment, Ruth said, about what I would say to you if I ever saw you again, about how I would make you understand what you did to me, what it felt like to be 17 and pregnant and alone, with nobody to call when Daniel died, nobody to help me raise Emma, nobody to tell me I was doing okay when I was exhausted and scared and trying so hard to be a good mother that I forgot what it felt like to be anything else. I had a whole speech prepared, pages and pages, everything you did wrong, everything you should have done instead, everything I survived in spite of you. She paused. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. But then Emma asked me why she didn't know anything about you, and I told her the whole story. And do you know what she said? Walter shook his head. She said, Mom, you have to let it go. She said, carrying that anger around is like drinking poison and hoping someone else dies. She said, if you ever see him again, you should tell him what you felt, and then you should try to forgive him. Not for him, for you. Ruth looked at Walter with an expression he couldn't read. She's smarter than both of us, she said. She gets that from her grandmother. Walter felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet. Maybe not ever, but something. A crack in the wall Ruth had built around herself. A door opening, just a crack. I can't promise to forgive you, Ruth said. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I want to, but I can promise to try. And I can promise that you can know Oliver. He deserves to know where he came from, even the parts that hurt. Walter looked at his daughter. He looked at the kitchen she'd built, the life she'd made, the person she'd become without him. And he felt the words rising up in him, the words he should have said 19 years ago, the words he should have been saying her whole life. I'm proud of you, he said. I know I don't have the right to say that. I know I wasn't there. I know I didn't help, and I didn't support you, and I didn't do any of the things a father is supposed to do. But I'm proud of you, Ruth. You're the strongest person I've ever known. You're stronger than me. You're stronger than my father. You're stronger than any Briggs who's ever lived on that mountain. And I'm sorry I couldn't see it when you were young. I'm sorry I was so busy trying to make you hard that I didn't notice you were already harder than I'd ever be. In the good way, in the way that matters. He stopped. His voice had given out. He was an old man, 74 years old, sitting at his daughter's kitchen table after walking 300 miles, and he had nothing left except the words he'd already said and the hope that somehow, impossibly, they might be enough. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked around the table. She stood in front of Walter looking down at him, and then she did something she hadn't done in 19 years, something she hadn't done since she was a little girl, before she learned to stop reaching for him because reaching never worked. She hugged him. It wasn't a long hug. It wasn't a movie hug, the kind where people hold each other and cry and everything is suddenly perfect. It was a short hug, careful, testing. The hug of someone who had been hurt too many times to trust easily, but was trying anyway. But it was a hug, and when Ruth pulled away, there were tears on her cheeks, and there were tears on Walter's, and they were both pretending not to notice. "You're staying for dinner," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Emma's coming over. She knows about you. I told her. She wants to meet you. She might yell at you a little. She's protective. You need to be ready for that." Walter nodded. He would be ready. He would be ready for whatever they needed him to be ready for. He had walked 300 miles. He could handle dinner. And Dad, Ruth said, using the word for the first time in 19 years, the word she'd thought she'd never use again. "Don't think this fixes everything. Don't think one conversation erases 19 years. We've got a lot of work to do. You've got a lot of work to do. This is just the beginning." "I know," Walter said, "and I'll do it. Whatever it takes, however long it takes." Ruth nodded. She wiped her eyes. She straightened her shoulders. "Good," she said. Then she turned toward the living room, where Oliver was playing. "Oliver," she called, "come set the table. Your great-grandpa is staying for dinner." Oliver came running, the wooden cross still in his hand. He looked at Walter with those serious eyes, and then he smiled. A real smile, the smile of a child who didn't know yet about estrangement and abandonment and 19 years of silence. "Are you going to tell me stories?" Oliver asked. "Old people always tell the best stories." Walter looked at his great-grandson. He looked at Ruth, standing in the doorway. He thought about Ellen, gone 13 years now, buried on the hill where he used to sit every morning. He thought about all the stories he'd never told, about the mountain and the house, and the generations of Briggs men who had lived and died there. He thought about the stories he would tell now if he got the chance. The stories that were true, the stories that mattered. "Yes," he said, "I'll tell you stories, as many as you want, for as long as you'll listen." Oliver grinned. Then he grabbed Walter's hand, the hand of a 74-year-old man who had walked 300 miles, the hand that had carved a wooden cross 47 years ago, the hand that had never held his daughter when she cried. And he pulled him toward the kitchen. "Come on," Oliver said. "Mama makes really good chicken, and she always gives me extra mashed potatoes if I ask nice." Walter let himself be pulled. He let himself be led into the kitchen of the house his daughter had built, the life she'd made, the family he hadn't known existed. He sat down at the table. He watched Ruth cook. He listened to Oliver talk about his school and his friends, and the book he was reading about dinosaurs. He waited for Emma to arrive, steeling himself for whatever she needed to say to him, knowing it would be hard, knowing he deserved every word. And somewhere deep inside him, in the place where his stubbornness lived, where his silence lived, where 74 years of choosing strength over softness had built walls so high he couldn't see over them, something shifted. Not much, just a little. A crack in the foundation. A small green shoot pushing up through concrete. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something. It was a start. Outside, the sun was setting. The light was going gold and amber, the way it always did at this time of day, the way it had gone every night for 1,000,000 nights before, and would go for 1,000,000 nights after. Walter watched it through the kitchen window, and he thought about all the sunsets he'd watched alone, on the mountain, in the house his grandfather had built. He thought about all the things he'd missed, all the years he'd wasted. And he thought about what the woman in the diner had said, "Don't wait. Whatever you have to say to your daughter, don't wait." He hadn't waited. He had walked 300 miles. He had bled through his boots. He had said the words. And now, impossibly, miraculously, by some grace he didn't deserve, he was sitting at his daughter's table, watching her cook dinner, listening to his great-grandson talk about dinosaurs. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't absolution. But it was more than he'd had yesterday. It was more than he'd had for 19 years. And for now, for tonight, it was enough. If you're watching this right now, I want you to take something from Walter's story, not just the obvious lesson, that pride destroys, that forgiveness is possible, that it's never too late to try. Those things are true, but they're not the whole truth. The whole truth is this. There are people in your life right now, maybe parents, maybe children, maybe old friends, maybe someone you loved once and let slip away, who are waiting. They're waiting for you to call. They're waiting for you to show up. They're waiting for you to say the words you've been carrying around like stones in your pockets, weighing you down, making every step harder than it has to be. You might think you have time. You might think you can do it tomorrow, or next month, or next year. You might think the words will be easier to say later, when you're more ready, when they're more ready, when the stars align and the universe makes it convenient. But the woman in the diner was right. You never know how much time you've got, and there's nothing in the world worse than running out of it. Walter Briggs walked 300 miles because he didn't have any other way to get there. Most of us have easier options: a phone, an email, a plane ticket, a drive across town. The distance isn't what matters. What matters is the willingness to cross it. What matters is the first step, putting one foot in front of the other, opening your mouth, saying the words that have been trapped inside you for so long, you've almost forgotten they're there. Forgiveness is not about saying what happened was okay. It's not about pretending the past didn't happen, or that the wounds don't still ache sometimes, late at night, when you're alone with your memories. Forgiveness is about deciding that the past has taken enough from you, that you're not going to let it take any more. Ruth didn't forgive her father in one night. She might never forgive him completely, but she opened the door. She let him in. She let him stay for dinner. She let her son sit on his lap and listen to stories about the mountain and the house and the generations who had come before. When they've hurt us, even when trusting they've hurt us, even when trusting them again, feels like the hardest thing we've ever done. Because the alternative, the closed door, the stubborn silence, the 19 years passing while we wait for someone else to make the first move, is no alternative at all. It's just another kind of death. The slow kind, the kind you don't notice until it's already taken everything that matters. Don't wait. Whatever you have to say it. Whatever distance you have to cross, start walking. The door might open, and what you find on the other side might break you. But it might also be the beginning of something you thought you'd lost forever. It might be the beginning of a second chance,